This is Pink Talks, the place where we discuss intersectionality and human rights.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining to another episode of our series on talks on sex education, a series in which we are exploring questions on how sex education can be inclusive, of high quality, and serve its purpose in informing people on how to make good choices about their sexual activities, relationships, and their sexual health. Also, we are discussing what may be going wrong with the sex education that most people receive today, if they receive any at all. And in today's talk, we will discuss about sex education in places where you least expect it. And my name is Femke, and I'm your co-host today with my colleague Leah.
Hi, I'm Leah, and I would like to introduce our guest, Holly V. Holly is a Ph.D. student in her second year at the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester in United Kingdom. Her research is on the emotional experiences of museum staff doing social justice work, aiming to generate knowledge about how we can transform our organizations through making room for feelings and the agency of activist staff. As part of this wider project, she conducted an interview project in the year 2020, exploring the professional emotional experiences of delivering sex education in museums. She's building on this project through presenting and seeking publication. And she's passionate about creating a sex positive, just, and compassionate society, and believes museums have a great potential to make this change. So, Holly, thank you so much for joining us today to speak on this very interesting and important topic. Is there anything else you'd like to maybe add from your bio, or maybe just about yourself or about your research?
I'm not sure if there is. So it's hi everyone. It's really, really nice to be here and to speak to you. And it's exciting that you're doing this fantastic topic and really kind of getting into the meat of it, because it is really important. I think probably, to be honest, my work is very much in a feminist framework. It's in a very collaborative framework. So everything that I do is about kind of talking to people, getting their expertise, getting their kind of emotional experience, and working together as a group. So I'm really excited always to be involved in any kind of discussion.
Great. So I know for Femke and myself, when we were developing this topic to discuss, we both have such a passion for sex education. And I think that comes from the lack of sex education through our adolescence and teen years. We really miss not having just good, but also comprehensive sex education. So could you tell us a bit about why do you have a personal passion for sex education, and where does that passion then stem from?
Yeah, so it very much same as you. It comes from the lack. It comes from the fact that I had really poor sex education growing up, even out of a kind of, moralistic, like abstinence only type situation. It's just that we were being delivered sex education by at all. And I really, as I got older and as I grew up, felt that lack quite keenly in my kind of emotional relationship with sex. So in a kind of non-professional, like very, very kind of personal sense, sex and sexuality is something that I've had quite an unhealthy relationship with in my life. And then as I kind of got into my later 20s, that's something that I decided I really wanted to work on. And I started just listening to a few like podcasts, enter that conversation in a way that was more comfortable. And it's like something just like clicked in my brain. Like it became something that I was really passionate about. I got really excited about how much amazing conversation there was out there about how incredibly beautiful it is as a topic, sexuality, about how exciting and weird and wonderful it is as something to kind of embrace as part of our human experience. And then I started to honestly feel a bit resentful. I was like, I've been denied this all my life because it's so taboo. And so I kind of started to move into wanting to incorporate it more into my work because my work was related to STEM, and it really felt like something that I was very lucky as a PhD student to now have the opportunity to kind of bring some of my professional life into that personal journey.
Nice, amazing. And yeah, so I think for me and Leah, when we first discovered you and your project, I think we were both very amazed because doing it seems so unusual to do sex education in a museum, and we really wonder you touched on it a bit now already, but how did the idea develop of doing sex education in a museum, and what did you want to achieve also with your project?
Yeah, so my project is, for anyone who's not familiar, essentially I did an interview project with 6 people doing museum education in the UK. So they are museum educators as their job. And they'd chosen to deliver sex education programs in their museums. Just kind of interested in it. It sadly just didn't have scope for audience impact because it was in kind of a tight time frame. But essentially what the purpose of it was to talk about the emotional and professional experience of delivering that work. So what does it feel like to be in education in a museum, which is obviously quite a traditional kind of institutional environment. And also what was your kind of emotional relationship with bringing sex education into that space. So I'm not a sex educator, but I kind of have therefore done a bit of working on the outer rim of it, and I've kind of on a lot in sex education for adults. So the kind of inspiration for it actually came, I was going to do something quite different when I was first talking to my supervisor about what my kind of short research project would be. And as part of this conversation I was having with myself about sex negativity, about feeling its presence in my own life and wanting to change that, and wondering about, starting to see all the places it came from sort of socially. One of the real influences for it, I kind of unfortunately realized, was in museums. In the museums are full of nudes, especially of women, especially of white women, so they're not very diverse. There's a very specific kind of standard of beauty that museums really uphold. And there's a lot of kind of politeness around it. There's a lot of desexualizing of sexual images in museums because they are family environments, they're public environments, and not unfairly, the museum doesn't necessarily feel equipped to kind of make that conversation a sexual one. So it kind of meant that because I grew up in museums, one of the reasons I work in them is I spent so much time constantly surrounded by these sanitized images of sex and these desexualized images of sex. And I do think it does something to impact your way of thinking about that topic and about your own body. And so what I sort of was originally thinking, and I'd over 2020, I also kind of came out to myself and to some close friends as queer. And so again, that really started to inform my feelings about having those conversations in that public space, where I was going I really feel like this is a conversation I could have had earlier if the spaces that I spent my youth in, so educational spaces, cultural spaces, had been having that conversation on the public gallery, because a lot of the time that conversation is tucked away into a separate private program, something that you have to kind of sign up to, something that means that if you're still self-discovering, if you haven't taken an identity yet or claimed an identity yet, you don't know to go to them. So it was something that had felt very, very cut off and very separated from me. And I really wanted that to change for other young people. I kind of would like to see that change in museums and have them as places of self-discovery and places where they can claim those identities on the gallery floor. And so with all that in my mind, I had also, in my sort of professional life, I used to work for an organisation called GEM, or the Group for Education in Museums, and it's a UK-based networking organisation where we work with museum educators, basically just to give them resources, training, conferences. It's a professional network. And through working for GEM, I met loads and loads and loads of museum educators who were really on kind of their museum's forefront of change. So the educator is the public face, it's the person that speaks most to audiences, it's the person that works most with communities. And so educators, not universally, but educators tend to have kind of their finger most on the pulse of what that community needs and what the kind of social issues around their museum are. In my experience, and lots of curators might shout at me for saying that, but in my experience, educators are really kind of pushing those boundaries. And in working with educators, because I was traveling around the UK doing lots of different events with them, they were constantly kind of coming out with these stories of, this is not to make, this is the issue that occurred that upsets me, whatever it is. It could be disability, it could be communities in poverty, like whatever's kind of local to them. And then they'd say, but for various reasons, I'm really struggling to move it forward in my museum. Not always, like museums genuinely are really trying, but it's just that there's so many institutional barriers through things like funding and issues that kind of big institutions face. And so I kind of had in one hand, I had lots of people who work in museums who I knew wanted to make change and were sort of struggling a bit to make change. And on the other hand, I have my experience as a visitor of the museum as being a place that needs a lot of change and kind of needs those voices. That's what led to my broader PhD, is that I kind of said, okay, how can we get these people's voices to make that change? What is stopping the museum from absorbing all of their wonderful values and wonderful plans? And that's kind of where my research is now. But the sex education part of it came out of me saying, well, it seems kind of odd to me that we have so many women who work in the sector. Museum education is predominantly women. And yet we're not talking a lot about gender. Like the museum is not overly critical of its own representations of women. And beyond that, it has lots and lots of other intersectional issues it needs to address. But from my kind of personal perspective, that's the thing that I notice most viscerally. And I thought that was very strange because we do have so many women working in the sector. I was sort of going, it seems odd to me that we aren't saying our own stories, that we're not bringing our own cause into our spaces. And so the sex education question I kind of developed over chewing all this over, and my wider research was basically, why is the museum not having this conversation? It was to go into galleries and say, look at all these nudes, look at all of these images of sex, like how are they being portrayed, and what about them is actually engaging that conversation? And then my supervisor basically said, that's a lovely question, but it's not going to make a dissertation because all you're going to be able to discover is they're not doing it. And then there's not a lot to go on from there. And so in that conversation, what he sort of ended up advising me was that, you work with educators, that's your field of expertise, so go talk to them rather than going and doing a gallery study, which is kind of not where my interests normally lie. And so I kind of put a call out to the UK network and said, is anyone doing sex education? It is quite rare. And I got 6 people want to talk to me in the end. And that conversation with them was basically about, like, why are you doing sex education? Because no one else is, because it's so rare. So it's about why are they doing it? What findings have they had as a professional? What impact has it made on their colleagues and their kind of working relationships? What has it stemmed from? What has it led to? And sort of get a bit of a picture of the potential that sex education has in the museum activism and museum education sectors to be an interesting lens on how the museum can be a change maker, because that's quite a big conversation in our sector, is how we can create and experience social change. So it was kind of about sex education as part of a world of activism that the museum sector engages quite heavily in activism, and sex education is very much not included in that, except these small pockets of practice. And it was sort of about, the wider aim of it was to try and reposition sex education and say, actually, this is a really essential part of activism. This is a really essential part of social change. If we want a just museum and a compassionate museum and a relevant museum, that needs to be a sex positive one. And it was to kind of try and bring that aspect of activism into that social change conversation that's really heating up in the sector, in a way it had been quite neglected. I say had been, like, as if I've made a massive change overnight. Like, this is a very, very early stage piece of work, but this is something that I would like to work on sort of as a professional long term. It's going to be a long term project. Why those people were doing it, because I think that I sort of should emphasize is that across the world we have sex museums, like museums of sex and sexuality. And we have kind of activist pop-ups. So the UK has a really fantastic, unfortunately over 2020 it lost its brick and mortar site, but still exists as an organisation called the Vagina Museum, and that is just about looking at the vagina, looking at the vulva, kind of dealing with the stigma around that body part. But I didn't want to look at any of those because they are such an unusual beast. They're a very specific thing. And what I wanted to do was say, where is this conversation in the mainstream museum? So I think I kind of want to emphasize is that everything I'm going to kind of say is very much relevant to a very specific type of institution that is the mainstream kind of more established museum that has maybe got sex education as a small part of its output. There is loads and loads and loads to be learned from sex museums. They're really amazing and interesting institutions, but they're not where my research was. So if kind of sex in museums is something that interests anyone watching, I do recommend that you just kind of go and have a little bit of a look at sex museums as a separate issue, because they are really fantastic.
Yeah, it's really great what you said too. I obviously as a child I would go and see paintings or like sculptures of naked women specifically, but it was always like almost pretending like they weren't naked and like
exactly, yeah,
and then there's no further questions of like why, what is behind this, like it just is beautiful and you just have to accept it and move on. I think too something you touched on like was that the space has these artifacts or paintings or and we're searching for answers, but none of them are given to us. So then where else do we go to find these like answers to our questions or to find our identity or gender, and the perfect place would be a museum, educational space. But instead, maybe we're going now, especially like online, and things aren't like, safe sometimes online. So I think it would be really great if we could have a change, especially like you said, in mainstream museums.
Yeah, that's a really key point, actually, is that what's great about the museum is that because it is a public and family space, it is a very safe space, to have that conversation. And all the educators doing that work had safe space building as a massive, massive concern. Like it dominated so many elements of those interviews. Because as an educator, you have to be great at safeguarding anyway. It's a big part of your professional role. But also just because they were very aware of the fact that sex is a very triggering topic. Like a lot of people find it very upsetting to talk about, either from a just kind of shame point of view, a general taboo point of view. They don't like breaking taboos. But also as a kind of combination of misogyny and racism and disability prejudice and many other very horrible things. Lots and lots and lots of people have sexual trauma, be that from a purely psychological perspective of just having to live in society and its very objectifying lens, or from kind of specific life events. And so they were very conscious of building these spaces that would be safe for people to kind of ask any questions, but also to feel vulnerable and to feel protected and to kind of not be, as you say, kind of going onto the internet and Googling stuff and finding out what hits you and on your search. Like they wanted it to be a space that you got really good information and really factual information that sort of wouldn't let you mystify. They wanted to demystify sex. That was the point of it, was to demystify it and also to defang it, to say this isn't a bad thing. Sex isn't a bad thing inherently. A lot of them emphasized kind of using mildly, because they still want to keep it respectful to, again, like to anyone who's feeling more uncomfortable, but using like humor and tension release, conversation. It was about a relaxed attitude to sex and a positive attitude to sex, and saying that you don't at all have to desire sex. That's completely up to you, but you shouldn't fear it. It shouldn't be something that feels dangerous or that feels dirty. It should be something that feels safe. And can be made safe, because they also obviously do talk about like general sexual health and sexual safety. So it's kind of the museum, I genuinely felt was, from what was saying, was a really well placed area for that, because it constantly sparks the conversation. You walk into that gallery and you are surrounded by those images, and it kind of gave the educators an opportunity to question how those objects are being portrayed, and to encourage other people to question it as well, which in turn can help you question everything else in society. So if you see like a woman, reclined with a mirror looking very, very idealized in her kind of naked form, then you can say like, well, is this what women look like? Is this how you look? Is this is this painted by a man, first of all? Or is it painted by a woman? Normally it's by a man. And they can get you to deconstruct that painting in a guided way, in a way that teaches you those skills, so that next time you see a music video, you can go, oh, well, actually, that's art. Like, that's not a true photograph. That's not what Nicki Minaj looks like in real life. They can start to like deconstruct the way that we as a society build the image of sex in the media. And they can kind of help build those sort of critical thinking tools. So the idea was, they very much understood that in an afternoon you can't answer everyone's questions about sex, but they wanted to create environments that made people go, sex is something I can question. It was to kind of spark that attitude. And that felt like the thing that kind of could make the big difference, was that they were conscious that as a museum, you're not a sex educator. They tended to partner with them. They would bring sex educators into the space to deliver those sessions. But they aren't, as an institution, a sex education institution. But what they are is a cultural institution full of art and full of the human body and full of human expression. And to kind of intertwine that with sexuality seemed to be a really effective way to kind of make that conversation flow and make it feel safe, and also make it feel a little bit depersonalized, rather than saying, I'm worried that my vagina looks weird. You can sort of go like, you can look at paintings and say, is that what it's meant to look like? And you can kind of depersonalize that question a little bit. So it kind of creates a bit more safety in that sense as well. So yeah, they created some really great spaces. And they also kind of questioned a bit around, because I realized I focused a bit on paintings, a little bit around like where sexuality lives in our brains. So for example, in the Roman era, we have loads and loads of phallus charms, like loads and loads of sort of ceramic and bronze, etc., just images of phalluses. And they're generally understood to be kind of good luck and prosperity charms and things, and sort of fertility. But what a lot of people in more traditional kind of museum education or academia circles would say is like, well, these aren't sexual objects because it was for fortune. And what you don't understand is in the modern day, we've like sexualized the penis in a way it never was before. And what they could kind of do was say, well, actually, I think the penis has always been quite sexual. And they could sort of say, rather than, and it's not saying these people are wrong. It's true, the phallus is an object of good fortune. That is what it is in these objects. But it's to say, well, why in our society have we decided that means it's not sexual? Why do we have to keep sex in a box? Why does it have to be severed off from everything else that could possibly relate to it? And so a stick version of sex education that is education about having sex, but it is also education about having a body, having relationships, experiencing the world in a physical way, and sensuality and society and all these things that sex education kind of encompasses, that you can be very, very fascinated by sex education and never have sex, because it's such a wide-ranging topic that touches on so many aspects of kind of your bodily autonomy and identity and how we interact with the world.
Mm-hmm. One thing that you had said before was that there's sex positive and then maybe there's sex negative attitudes. So can you explain what you mean and maybe what the difference is between those?
Yeah, so sex positivity is not yet kind of a unified definition. And what I ended up doing for my project was basically going away and looking at lots of different organizations, things like Planned Parenthood and Institutes of Sex Education. And I kind of looked at what their definitions were and sort of crafted what I wanted to say it as. I've actually got it written down, so I'm going to quickly check what I ended up using. So the definition I ended up using in the project was sex positivity is an attitude towards consensual adult sex that is non-shaming, non-fearing, and comfortable with questioning, trauma-informed and accepting of asexuality and non-sexual lifestyles, so it doesn't require desire for sex, but it encourages an informed, comfortable, and curious relationship with sex. And it also challenges intersectional issues of sexual oppression and inequality. So the idea of that is essentially to say that sex, a lot of the time it's positioned in opposition to sex negativity. So sex negativity is kind of two main things, is that it's very, very seated in shame. So it's an understanding that sex is inherently shameful or inherently harmful. And it really encourages mystification of sex, distaste for sex, kind of seeing sex as something that is vulgar and not appropriate for public conversation. And also that therefore kind of tries to control the ways that we have our own sexual worlds. So what is moral sex and immoral sex? It's that kind of attitude. And very much sex negativity comes from being very entrenched in in a kind of all of the normativities that we have in society that we need to deconstruct. So it often includes a lot of racism, a lot of ableism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. Like it's sort of built around it's kind of an attitude to sex that comes from a very controlled and normative way of perceiving the human body and human relationships. And its kind of weapon is shame, and it kind of has therefore quite profound mental health effects on our society, on us in general, because it really encourages it really encourages lack of sexual exploration, lack of sort of self exploration. Whereas sex positivity is about saying, actually, sex is a large part of the human experience. It's something that we are faced with every day in our media, even if it's not something we want in our personal lives. And if it is something we want in our personal lives, it's something that can be very difficult to navigate safely because there's so much misinformation and so much shame. So it's about kind of we're all comfortable with, that we all understand and can make informed choices about, and specifically is very kind of pleasure-centric, joy-centric. It's not about what is the purpose of sex. Sex is for reproduction, or sex is for marriage, or something like that. It's about saying that sex is something that you as a human individual can kind of make up your own mind about and seek your own pleasure in. I hope that makes sense. It's a bit of a thorny one.
Yeah, no, that's a great explanation. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, and I think it makes so much sense, and I really like doing some research about sex education and how we relate to sex. Like I really wonder why sex has, like, in our society, such a problematic and taboo topic. I mean, it's probably like that's a huge question, right? But I really I find it like amazing how uncomfortable most people are talking about, and I wonder why also. Like I wonder where this like stigma came from also. I wonder if like religion has lots to do with it, or I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, I think, and a historian could answer this way better than I could, because it's so entrenched in so many different periods of history in so many different ways. But like religious stuff will definitely have a big part of it, kind of moralizing over many years. For coming from a UK context, the thing that I kind of did quite a bit of reading around was kind of sex negativity and like colonialism, and specifically that kind of 18 to 1900s period of British Empire, where sex negativity is a really massive tool of colonial patriarchy. It's a very excellent control mechanism. So essentially, the British Empire, when it kind of went out into the world and plundered and looted and did terrible things, one of the kind of key aspects of kind of imposing colonial ideals on those cultures in order essentially to like prevent rebellion, in order to like more effectively oppress and kind of take them into the empire, is very centered around like kind of bodily autonomy and being able to define what is the ideal body, what is the correct body, what is the moral body. And there's lots of really, really ugly sort of fake science done in this period that hierarchizes like the white male and then the white female, and going down in like very, very, very specific segregated races and genders to exactly what the normative person should be. And the Victorian period especially, so the kind of the 1800s in the United Kingdom, is this like, and across Europe as well and the West as well, but Britain is a real center for it, is this period of extreme normativity. There is so much obsession with categorizing and sort of on taxonomy and making everything absolutely scientifically rigid in its definitions, which includes gender, which includes the body. And we get these, as an example, like the Natural History Museum in London still has the specimen that is the example of that species, of like every species. So, this is a sparrow, and this is what a sparrow looks like. This is the ultimate sparrow. And they'll kind of keep that as like, that's how we do the taxonomy of the bird, is that we have this sparrow. But they essentially did that with humans. The British Empire did that with humans. And it was a big way to bolster white British pride and the white British support for the empire, and then to suppress other nations and other peoples, and also their sexual practices. So like a huge relationship exists between decoloniality and queering, because so much queer life was extinguished by the British Empire, or attempted extinguished by the British Empire. And a lot about decoloniality is kind of bring that queerness back and say, well, actually, what have we been told was always normative in our society that actually never was until the empire kind of stamped on it. And then we also have this kind of period of it's this period of like, so we have this understanding that like emotion is for silly women. It's something that, you know, men are not emotional, men are rational creatures. And there's some fantastic kind of sarcastic tweets out there about how men have successfully rebranded anger as not an emotion, which means they don't have to count themselves as emotional beings. But like how rationality and science and proof and evidence were like a male thing, and then emotion and feeling and instinct were female things, and they were lower ways of thinking. And sex is something we only do with that part of ourselves. No one has rational sex. I hope not anyway. So it kind of, all of this, at least United Kingdom history, and therefore, you know, very sadly, the history of many other parts of the world. So much of it comes out of these mechanisms of control. It's about keeping a very certain type of wealthy, straight, cisgendered, able-bodied white man in his position. And one of the ways that class could do that was by saying, you are dirty because you are sexual. You are a sexualized object, or you are an emotional fool. And they would sort of create these labels for women, for people of color, for disabled people, for working class people, for queer people. And it is a very, very effective tool that sadly has kind of continued into our modern society. We have so much legacy of that now to disentangle, which is one of the reasons that I am, is that it is so rooted in the body and in our emotional world that it does so much just in existing to start to tackle that kind of social construct that we now live with the legacy of.
Yeah, I think that's a very important take on sex education, and a very complete analysis. I think you answered the question very, very well. Yeah, and something that we were also wondering was, so we already established that traditionally sex education would, like, if it would happen at all, it would happen, for example, in schools, and well, like these educators and also you yourself, like you chose to promote for sex education happening in public spaces, and we were wondering like what your opinion is that like the role that public spaces should or are playing in informing about sex education and sexual health and all of these other very important topics that you touched upon.
Yeah, so I think public spaces are, I mean, obviously it varies between public spaces. So some of them just don't touch it, loads of them don't touch it. But the ones that do, I think essentially it's probably kind of twofold. One is that you can make a specific program. So everyone I was speaking to had a specific internal program to the museum where you booked as a school group or you booked as a community group, and you went and received an afternoon of sex education from a museum's strengths. So often using art as like a conversation starter. And those kind of things are just really great because it takes you out of a school environment. Schools are, you know, often not very, not the most pleasant environments for teenagers to be in, just because they're there every day and they don't want to be. And it kind of takes you out of that world and into somewhere that is just full of very pretty things, that often has a kind of slightly more fun person delivering to you because they're not your everyday teacher. So you kind of get like a new voice, and often it's a very engaging, often quite youthful voice, because that's who they're hiring to do sex education and community education. And so it kind of gives you a bit of a breather, a different space, and because you're in a different space, you can maybe have a different attitude. It kind of gives you some permission to think differently. And I think that's kind of one of the key things about that internal program. And then what role a public space is playing in a kind of more general sense, because I think sex education is something that is key for young people and key for schools, but also something we should never give up. You know, it should exist throughout your life. And certainly learning about yourself should exist throughout your life in any aspect. Is that the thing that I want to see a lot more of is museum and public spaces as spaces essentially that don't ban that conversation, that don't prohibit that conversation. So it's not that I need every single museum to suddenly like completely remodel its galleries to be full of like super sex informed, sex educational labels every time there's a painting of a naked woman, because that is one aspect of those artworks. It's not the only aspect. And I understand that they want to kind of cover lots of different things. And they do have to be mindful of like, not everyone's ready for that conversation. You don't want to force that conversation. But what I do want to see is a reduction of shame in the public space. So changing how we have our museum galleries or our other public spaces, for example, sex education conversations can be sparked by things like statuary in parks and stuff like that. So just kind of, and anywhere where it becomes relevant in a public space, I would really like to see there being just a little bit more encouragement and a bit more comfort for people to do that question, even if it's privately in their own head or with the person that they're with. So as an example, I went to a medical museum with my mum as a visitor. This is nothing to do with my project. And because it's a medical museum, lots of like weird implements and stuff in it. And one of the things it had in a kind of display of like, here's some stuff we've got, you know, it wasn't themed around sexuality at all, was a chastity belt. And a chastity belt is like a really, really horrible thing. It's a medieval device, thankfully. It's not been used in a very long time, but where husbands could essentially lock their wives' like pelvic area away. So it's essentially like a metal set of panties with a big lock on it. And it means that a woman can't have sex, but it also means that she has a vast amount of hygiene problems for the next, like, you know, X number of months that he's away. And the idea obviously was that, you know, as a husband, he owned his wife's body. She is kind of his sexual object, and she is his sexual possession, is sort of all of the things that the chastity belt represents. And all this museum label had was like, chastity belt, 1600s. And we're going, this is such a violent and upsetting object. And you've not even explained what it is. There's been no kind of discussion of what it could, in their back of house. There's obviously not been a discussion of how it can feel to be a female visitor, to look at that and just be faced with it. And so me and my mum, both as women, walked in and we were like, oh, and we were quite upset by it. And my mum immediately, like, there was this like comedically tense pause. We're both just looking, we've been quite confronted by this quite ugly object of our kind of historical, very, very horrible historical oppression. And then my mum just goes, so the guy with the most kids is the locksmith then? And just like, and it like broke the tension. And I was laughing my head off like the rest of the day. But it was this great kind of, the fact that my mum was comfortable enough to do that joke with me meant that I could extricate myself from that conversation. But it is, yeah, like a lot of the time the public space won't acknowledge that a sexual object is present, even when it is something as incredibly explicit as a chastity belt. And what I would really like to see is just a label that kind of goes, this is what this is. That's not very good. You know, something that just kind of gives you a little bit of reassurance that the museum is going to hold your hand a little bit as you have this moment, or even have them consider a bit around stuff like content warnings. So content warnings, there's a really amazing article that I read about content warnings as a kind of site of control and of normativity, in that we often warn against sex more than violence in TV and in museums. And just the absolute absurdity that we are more comfortable watching someone get beaten up or murdered than we are watching two people have consensual and pleasurable sex. And especially in terms of like family stuff and children, we're so much more comfortable with children seeing violence than boobs. It's like a very unfortunate state of affairs. And with kind of this, all of this builds the narrative as you get, you know, it's not that we frequently have people turn to us and say sex is bad and shameful, but this constant putting of sex into this position of needing a content warning and being worse than violence, but also being okay to see a chastity belt, you know, like all these kind of weird messages will by osmosis have an effect on us. And what I want to see essentially therefore is galleries that are much more conscious of what do they warn against, what do they not warn against, what do they put on their labels, what do they leave off their labels, where do they display things, why, who gets to see them, to have those conversations. I think the main issue that I'm seeing in a lot of museums, and to be clear, museum workers are really hard workers. They're really great people. I'm not trying to like dunk on anyone, but in this specific aspect, there is a lack of conversation happening back of house, and that is what is creating these like bizarre gallery experiences like me and my mum had. And what I would really like to see is that conversation being brought into the staff, so that we can then have an informed approach to what in our museum is a sexual object, and what does it mean to display it, and therefore what questions do we need to ask ourselves, and what kind of decisions do we need to make. And because we're all humans living in the same context of sex being super taboo, it's very difficult to bring that conversation into our professional spaces. So I think it's that kind of, we need to create a public space where people can have those questions and have those conversations and can feel nurtured by the environment they're in and reassured by the environment that they're in when they are confronted with either pleasurable or very non-pleasurable images.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. You talk about like the content warning. Like as a child, I did have a space, like a safe space to explore sexuality, because my mom limited my brother and I to violence. So we weren't allowed to even watch like Power Rangers or anything like that. But we were allowed to watch, you know, videos that had like movies that had maybe a kissing scene or like some nudity. That was more acceptable in my household, like personally. And I do think having that safe space really allowed me to explore more and be more open to things. But in your opinion, what are the best ways to maybe create these safe spaces, like not only in museums, but also like within our communities and maybe even like personally with our friends or families?
That's a really good question. So I'll kind of go back to the, I guess it's kind of what you mean by safe space, in terms of there's the passive one of like being able to walk into a gallery and feeling safe, and then there's kind of the active one of there's a conversation happening, there's a workshop happening. How is that built? And so I'll kind of talk about the workshop one a bit first, just because that's the main thing that the my interviewees were talking about. And so they talked a lot about safe spaces. And one of them actually also talked about a concept of what she called the brave space. And for her, the brave space was about saying, you know, we acknowledge that sex is very difficult to talk about, and we are asking you to step into this space in good faith and to be honest and to ask your questions and to be curious, even though that does take some courage. So it was kind of acknowledging that there's anxiety, but trying to make it more of an equal space where it's not just about us as educators delivering to you as students, but you as students also bringing yourselves into this space and kind of having some trust. That was then also kind of built into the making of the safe space. So the principles of it were essentially that they would start the session with a lot of like groundwork, a lot of just kind of building of ground rules, which included things like reassurances. So for example, there are no stupid questions. And not only are there no stupid questions as in you can feel safe to ask us anything, but there are no stupid questions as in you may not laugh at each other's questions. So to kind of say, we are in a space together and we will respect all of each other's different questions, different curiosities, different needs. And to kind of essentially quite heavily moderate that space. And they talked a lot about the balance that they had to strike between being very relaxed and ensuring that space is quite conversational, quite easygoing. Often there's some humor, you know, like you can kind of break the tension because you can basically, at some point, especially with teenagers, but honestly with adults as well, if you kind of go, here is a shungo art of two people having sex, immediately they will giggle. And rather than going like, don't laugh, this is a serious educational setting, they'd be like, yeah, like, hey, why are we laughing? Let's actually ask the question of why we laugh at this. And suddenly everyone goes, oh, why am I laughing? And it kind of helps them open that conversation. And it also reassures people that, like, we had a lovely quote from one of them that basically just said, sex is fun. And she was like, if sex is fun, I want my workshop to be fun. Like, I want them to associate sexuality with fun. So there's a lot of kind of, I think, needs to talk about joy and levity and like enjoyment of being in that space, and saying that because sex is inherently hopefully inherently a fun thing, or certainly can be a very fun thing, we want to associate this conversation with fun. Whereas I think the current sex education model in schools, at least, is like sex is inherently very dangerous, and you are allowed to have fun only after you have passed all of these tests of morality and safety. So it's very much like, don't laugh, this is serious. And there's a lot of, you have to know these things. Or like I went to school like cough years ago, but also I very much had a sex education that was like, it was so drastic. It was like, if you don't use a condom, you will get chlamydia and you will die. It was like really dramatic. Like all of the consequences were so huge to everything. And one of the things that I feel like really good sex education does is say like, sometimes things will go wrong. That's actually fine. Like it sort of lets you feel like sex is allowed to be messy and imperfect, and that you will always heal. You will always move on. You always grow, as long as you kind of have your autonomy and your communication. And they're the kind of key things that they want to teach you, is that self-advocacy and your compassion towards your partner, or however many partners. So there's kind of a lot of stuff around like that aspect of making it kind of fun and relaxed, but also moderating it quite heavily to ensure that no one's making fun of each other, to kind of note who's maybe not speaking so much. Are they not speaking because they're happy listening, or are they not comfortable speaking? Is someone maybe speaking too much and drowning out others? So it takes quite a lot of balance and care. And this is one of the reasons why it was so great to talk to educators, is that that's what they do all the time, regardless of topic, is they're very good at moderating that kind of space and that discursive space. And they also had a few other tips, like focusing on confidence building, encouraging people, making people feel like they were listened to, in general, encouraging listening from them, but also modeling that as a facilitator, being a really good listener. Sensitive but straightforward was a really nice one that came up a lot. So being very conscious that this is a taboo, that people do find this uncomfortable, and being sensitive to that and patient with that. And because there can be a bit of an aspect in kind of sex educated communities of like, oh, well, I'm super blasé about this because I've been doing sex education for X many years. But understanding that for lots of people, this is a very difficult topic, and being very gentle with them with it. It doesn't have to be about being like super cool and overconfident. It can just be, this is difficult. Let's listen. Let's talk about something really normal and really, it can be something as simple as like, I'm worried that I'm not going to put a condom on properly. It doesn't have to be like big, kinky topics. It can be just being very gentle, but also straightforward. So they were very clear about we use the proper terms for genitalia, and we use the proper terms for different acts and positions and stuff like we don't sit there using euphemisms, and we don't use roundabout ways of answering questions. Like we will answer a question in a way that in some, circles of society, people might go, oh, that feels quite vulgar, or that feels a bit inappropriate. And they'd go, well, no, it's straightforward. Like we have to use this language because otherwise we confirm that language is bad and that act is bad. So all of that. And then kind of key thing as well is just kind of confidentiality, privacy, ensuring that people are coming into a space where they know that what's here stays here. So that there was a lot of kind of really good workshop safe space building, and if anyone kind of wants to run something like this, if you kind of Google like build a safe space in a workshop, loads of people have blogged about this really well. In terms of building a safe space in a more casual way, so like in your family home or in your community, I think that is a really, really good question, because you are always going to be, to an extent, subject to kind of everyone else's attitudes as well, right? Like you can be the most wonderful and loving and fantastic sex educator in the world, but if the person that lives next door is really sex negative, their voice is going to stay present, so it's really complicated and really difficult. And what I think the key thing probably to do is a lot about modeling behavior. It's kind of so going back to that like sensitive but straightforward, it's sort of about saying like, I'm going to be much more comfortable just saying these words or stating these facts, and within reason, because you do want to be sensitive to like, you don't need to walk into a pub and start like announcing all of last night's activities, but kind of thinking about how you're going to kind of model someone who does not see sex as a negative thing. So like an example of this in kind of like my own life is that I've been working quite hard on saying I'm on my period. Like it's something that I never used to tell people. Like if I was late for a class, or if I had to skip a meeting because I get quite bad pain, I would be like, oh, I had a stomach bug. I would always kind of find a way to conceal it. And what I've been working on in kind of my stage that I'm on now is saying like, actually, I couldn't make it because I was on my period. Like is saying like, that's not a shameful thing. Lots of people who have periods have difficult times on them. And being able to say that in a way that, like, if I model that I'm comfortable with it, especially when I talk to like other menstruators, they'll immediately go, oh, me too, like rubbish times. Like people are very sympathetic. Like no one actually goes, oh, I don't want to hear that. So a lot of the time it's about giving people that permission to, if you're comfortable with it, they'll often come into that space with you. And what a lot of the people that I interviewed found, they talked a lot about kind of like, how did they build this environment in their workplace? So, you know, if you're going to bring sex education in, how do you build the trust to have that conversation among your colleagues? And they kind of found like two really key, really nice things kind of came out of that. And one was just about building trust. And that was partly through a slightly less relevant thing of like, you know, they'd done previous activist work and it builds a bit of a reputation. So it's kind of that holistic approach of, I am someone who can be spoken to about these topics. But also they did a lot of just opening themselves to anxiety, just saying like, if you don't want to do a sex education topic, I'm not going to shout at you and say, you're not a good activist. What I'm going to do is say like, let's have coffee. What's upsetting you? And they'd be really sympathetic to that. So if someone says like, I don't think it's going to be good for our audiences, 9 times out of 10, what they mean is, I'm worried about getting in trouble. You know, I'm worried about getting a complaint, or I'm worried about getting safeguarding questions raised, because that is a very disappointing thing about sexuality, is that every time someone mentions that it exists, everyone immediately like cries safeguarding. So it kind of, a lot of the time those anxieties were actually much more personal and much more emotional, and they'd sort of taken this veneer of like, I'm risk averse because of financial issues, or I'm risk averse because of trustee issues. Like a lot of the time it was actually, I'm worried I'll do it wrong. I'm worried that it's going to create conflict. It was something like much more emotional. And I think that's an organizational professional thing, but we can bring it into our communities and our families, in that people will say, I don't want to talk about having sex in my family home because I think it would be inappropriate for my children to think of me existing in that context. Like I don't want them to think about it. But what that often kind of actually means is, I'm embarrassed. I don't want to damage my relationship with my child. It's a much more, often we have a very moralistic and very like propriety based reason outwardly for not wanting to discuss sex. And often the truth of it is something a bit different and something a bit more. And what they kind of found was that by creating these quite empathetic spaces where they could just really openly say like, no judgment, what's bothering you? And just really gently kind of say like, I'm here for you if you just want to tell me what you're worried about. It was kind of about, essentially what I'm saying is that I think one of the ways you build the safe space is not only by saying we won't shame sexuality and your questions about sexuality, but also saying we won't shame your shame. Like it's kind of saying we all acknowledge that we've all been damaged. Like we all got born into the same society that won't let us have this conversation, and saying, therefore, like it's okay if you really don't want to talk about this. It's okay if you struggle with this. It's okay if you don't feel blasé, or if you think your interests are like, you know, boring. Like there's no such thing as boring sex, just like have nice sex that you enjoy. But like if you feel that, if you have that insecurity, then saying to people like, actually those feelings are normal. Those feelings have been put into you by society on purpose lots of the time. And we're going to be sympathetic to that and patient with that. And we're just going to hold each other's hands and work through it together. A lot of the time they found that was more effective than that kind of drum banging, like campaigning side to sex education, which is still very, very valuable and very needed, but it can make people feel a bit put upon. It can make people go, that's not a conversation I have. You know, so kind of saying, hey, me too, this is difficult for all of us was really valuable. And modeling that, being a little bit more comfortable yourself, being more patient and open yourself kind of gives people a lot of permission. And then the other side is kind of being a little bit accepting, because I think this is important for activists so that they don't burn out as well, is being accepting that not everyone's going to get it. Like just honestly, you can't change everyone. But what you can be is a space for the people that do want to change. You know, so in your communities, you can have your sex education center, and a bunch of people are just never going to come, and a bunch of people aren't going to like that you exist. And you can do your best to speak to those people, but don't make it your main job. Like your main job is to be there for the people that do need you and for the people that are ready. And I think having that space to go to when we all, you know, when we need that bit of an escape from quite a sex negative world, I think is a really lovely start and a really important start to making a wider social change, because word of mouth will change things. I went to this place and it was really useful for me. Maybe you should try it too. We'll tell 10 people, a lot of the time it's about creating that place in a more personal way, and that will ripple out eventually into a sort of safer and more positive community. And just as like a practical note, also just talk to like anyone who will help you. Nearly loads of people who worked with sex education in the interview groups that I worked with, they worked with the NHS, so our National Health Service. They worked with social workers. They worked with sex educators. They worked with artists. Like there are lots of people with different areas of expertise. And definitely as a kind of museum educator, a lot of the time you feel quite ill-equipped, because you're like, well, I actually know how to tell you about like the Romans. I don't really know how to deal with this big social conversation. So you bring in those partners and those allies. Like finding allies is really key to that safe space, because when someone comes forward and says in your museum, I'm not comfortable with X object, I want to have a conversation about it, you can either say, I've done lots of learning, talk to me, or you can say, actually, we've got this great artist educator, we've got this great nurse, you kind of know who you can like bat people towards. So having a network as well is really useful.
I think what you said about like role models and how you as a role model can like alleviate a lot of the shame, I think that's very beautiful. And I think also personally I have made this experience a lot, because growing up, like I had a lot of shame around many topics, especially growing up as a girl and a woman, like the things you're not supposed to do or say or everything, right? And meeting like women who are very straightforward and they talk about all these taboos, like it helped me so much to try to like become that woman as well, right? And I think it's super important, and not to be underestimated how like what impact you can have just being honest, and like being like brave. Also what you said about like brave spaces, right? I think that was also very beautiful. Yeah. Well, and the last thing we wanted to touch on is so I know you already touched upon it as well in our conversation, but also we know that it's an idea, like an important idea of your work, and it is in the topic of intersectionality. And maybe you can explain really quickly like what you mean by intersectionality, and related to that, you also mentioned in one of your texts that sex education can be a very powerful anti-oppressive tool. And I thought that was such a cool thing, like such a powerful statement. So could you like elaborate on that, or tell us like what do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, of course. So intersectionality, just to kind of do the definition, and this is where I now like get it wrong, but it's a concept that a lawyer called Kimberly Crenshaw came up with, which was essentially that it was to recognize that a lot of the time in kind of diversity and inclusion programs and conversations being had in institutions, people were sort of focusing on single protected characteristics. So if you are a woman, what is your experience of discrimination? If you are a Black person, what is your experience of discrimination? And so what Kimberly Crenshaw essentially said was, what if you are a Black woman? You live at the intersection of two different oppressions. And so when people have a conversation to you about gender, inevitably you need to bring in conversations about race and vice versa. And those conversations were often not equipped for that. So if people were doing a study on women being held back in the workforce, she would say, but as a Black woman, I have a very different experience of that. And so intersectionality was kind of a theory that built out of her work to say, we need to recognize that we all have a very individual experience that lives at various intersections of normativity and of oppression. And to say that a queer Black person or a trans woman or a white man with a disability will all have a slightly different experience of society and of barriers in society and of expectations put on them. And it's so incredibly important just because it gives you a much truer picture of oppression and of social change and of the human experience within that. And it's now actually like there's some, I am very, very, very not equipped to go into great detail on this. I need to do a ton more reading on it. But there's some amazing work done, especially in Black feminism, around intersectionality and in what way it serves us as a theory and in what way it doesn't. Because specifically, it's incredibly important. Like, it's a massive milestone in kind of feminist theory and in general, like, inclusion practice. But also, there's a lot of movement, you know, to kind of come away a little bit from that slightly tick boxy approach to what your human experience is. Because if you are a Black woman, being Black is not a homogenous thing, and being a woman is not a homogenous thing. So to kind of very much continue, not as all to throw it out, very much continue to use it, and it's really, really important, but also to kind of think a little bit about the fluidity of our identities, about the complexities of our identities, about how we all identify and define what we use as quite homogenous terms, and to basically to be, when we think about social change, when we think about the changes that need to happen, to be trying to base it in kind of compassion for the individual, compassion for our humanity, and like all of the massive spectrums and complexity that comes with that. So with that in mind, like, the reason that I do find sex education, in my opinion, to be such a powerful anti-oppressive tool is that in your sexual life, and by that I also mean your kind of sensual life, so your life of your body, your life of pleasure, your life of physical feeling, and just the senses, because sexuality so much encompasses those things. It is, for me, and in fairness, not everyone will feel this, but it is for me the place that I am kind of most made human, like most made natural human, as opposed to social constructed person. And so that the tool of it, in that kind of very, very emotional sense, sex education is a fantastic anti-oppressive tool, because it kind of moves you away from being like a rational perspective on what you should have according to your DEI policy in your organization. And instead it says, like, what do I feel? How do I experience the world in first person? And it kind of asks us to be much more compassionate and much more complex in our view of that. Whereas a thing that I think can be a bit of a risk when we do, it's very important work to be doing kind of diversity, equality, inclusion work and training and organizational professional stuff, like, all of that is important. I'm not at all saying that it should be scrapped or that it isn't good. But it can create the slightly tick boxy feeling of, like, as long as you have employed X number of women, then you've done your gender diversity, like you've solved gender. But what we need to be looking at a lot more is, like, what does it mean to be a woman? How do we define woman? How does your gender feel? What is your experience of being gendered? How do you gender yourself? And all of those kind of questions are very unwelcome in a lot of these kind of, like, DEI programs, because it's not relevant to the organization's output and the organization's kind of view of itself. And that could be true, and that's also true of things like governmental stuff, you know. So if you get, like, your census, it will be like, tick your gender, tick your race. But if you don't feel represented by those exact tick boxes, then you're a bit like, I feel lost at sea. I don't feel recognized. So for me, sex education is really important, because it teaches us to look beyond a lot of the ways that we've been taught to define each other and define ourselves, and to take a much more kind of loving and holistic attitude to that, and a much more embodied attitude to it. We think a lot more in terms of the senses. We think a lot more in terms of our physical experience when we're talking about sex. And it means that it gives us a lot of tools to go out into the world and do that with other things. So my research, my broader research isn't about sex education. It looks at work. It looks at the world of museum work. And we talk about work in a completely different way to how we talk about sex. Work is a rational thing that you do to, because you have a passion, but your passion is like a professional passion. And it's not, we don't talk about it as like an embodied, feelings-based physical experience. We don't talk about how it feels in your stomach to do something activist, you know, to get something right in your museum that you're really proud of. We don't talk about how it feels in your shoulders to, like, hold yourself tensely at your desk while you're stressed about something. And the thing that I really want to kind of see change is being able to talk about ourselves in this much more human way, where we acknowledge our embodied experiences and our lived experiences, and we have these kind of, we take on much more complex kind of standpoints as humans who operate in the world with lots and lots of complexity, both mentally but also emotionally and physically. And there's loads of like, I'm garbling it so badly, but there's some fantastic feminist reading around this, and feminist standpoint theory has been really informative for me. Black feminism has been really in the not enough of it that I've read. Black feminism has got some amazing work on this. And you get kind of writers like Audre Lorde kind of talks about like the difference between porn and erotic, and the idea of like the erotic is not just a sexual experience, it's a kind of bodily experience. And so you get some really fantastic, very poetic work done by these theorists that's sort of encouraging us to say many forces from work to community to academia have really encouraged us to kind of like sever our minds from our bodies and to almost see our bodies as like enemies of our minds. And it can create a lot of poor health. Like it means we don't look after ourselves very well. We don't take rest. We don't enjoy being physical people in the way that we sort of naturally should. But we also, it sort of encourages a lot more. It comes a lot more from this stuff that I talked about earlier of like hierarchizing human bodies, objectifying human bodies. So it kind of encourages a lot of very unhealthy ways and harmful ways of seeing each other and seeing people who are different from ourselves. And so I think sex education, because it so much relies on bringing your heart and your body into a conversation, it really helps us break down some of these stereotypes and sort of tick boxy ways we have been taught to see each other. So when we look at each other, we can see a whole person as opposed to a person who identifies in these categories. And what that must mean, because obviously those categories are homogenous. So like it lets us be a lot more messy as people, is kind of the like really floopy one. And then I think like the other aspect of it that is a little bit more grounded is like sex education, because it is about the body. It naturally talks a lot about decoloniality. It talks about the way in which a person experiences, because essentially because it talks about power. To backtrack slightly, what you get a lot of questions about from young people, and what is addressed a lot by educators is the dynamics of power. How disempowering sex can feel when, first of all, when we don't know about it, when we're sort of plundering into it and we don't really know what we're doing. But also how disempowering it can feel to be a person who is interested in sex surrounded by horrible, horrible images of it all the time. Like we are kind of surrounded constantly by stories of sexual violence. We are surrounded constantly by images of like very, very doctored photographs and very pornographic doctored ideas of what sex looks like. And it's very difficult for us to navigate what sex means to us as individuals and what we want and what we are like interested in exploring and curious about without hitting all of these like quite unpleasant things. And so because sex education is kind of actively trying to deconstruct all of those images in order to help us have a better relationship with the act of sex or with the concept of sex, it therefore has to deconstruct patriarchy. It has to deconstruct white supremacy. It has to deconstruct ableism. It has to deconstruct heteronormativity. Otherwise, we can't deconstruct all the things that give us a bad sex life. So it kind of naturally in how it works, it brings together this very intersectional, this looking at all the different ways that oppression works. It brings all of those together to have a conversation about deconstructing what is put on us and what we expect and what we're afraid of and what oppresses us, and essentially what takes our power. Because the key thing of sex education is that you need to feel empowered to have good sex, as in you need to feel empowered to communicate your needs. You need to feel empowered to protect your safety. You need to feel empowered to choose a partner who is right for you. And none of those things are possible if you don't feel empowered to do those things, if you feel that you don't have agency. Agency is so important to good sex. And if agency is important to good sex, then good sex education tells you about agency. And suddenly you're there going, why don't I have agency in all these other aspects of my life? It really helps kind of, it really attacks those mechanisms of control that impact us in so many ways beyond our sexuality. And it does it in a very intimate way and in a very emotional way. Because I think if we kind of say, like what a lot of people found in the interviews was that when they were talking about sex education with their colleagues, and museums have got some diversity in, but not enough. So a lot of the time they were talking to people who probably had quite a high degree of social power. they really found that sex education, after you kind of worked over the anxieties and the bumps and the difficulties, became a very personal topic to people in a way that not everything else necessarily would. So if you kind of go, I really think we should do anti-racism exhibitions. I think we should do like a really powerful anti-racism message in our museum. What is very unfortunate, but is true, is that like, because we have a largely white body of workers, there's a lot of people who aren't viscerally attracted to doing that. They might still do it. It's not that no one's interested in it, but there has been historically quite a lot of either pushback or just kind of lethargy around anti-racism in museums, as there has been in like every institution because of white supremacy. Because as white people are not naturally inclined to think about the experience of racism. And so they don't, or not socially inclined to think about the difficulties of racism. And so there's so much advocacy and so much like pressure that has to be put on that institution in order to make it like really properly tackle it. Whereas if you bring sex education forward, basically everyone has a bad experience of it, and everyone kind of has an amount of personal investment in it, whether or not they are totally comfortable with the topic. If you get them talking, people will kind of go, yeah, actually, I am quite worried about that. You know, it feels very close to home. It feels very, very embedded in all of our personal experiences, is the experience of having a sex life, regardless of how you define it. And so it suddenly became a conversation that was surprisingly easy to have. Like, for all of its many challenges, once you got people on board, they were really on board because they like viscerally, humanly connected with it in a way that was not sort of trained into them by trying to be a good social justice person. It was something that they just really cared about because it affected them. But from that, you can go, well, hey, if you really care about this, let's talk about decolonialism, because we've talked so much about how viscerally important you find equality of the human body. You know, so it kind of creates lots of inroads to these very, very thorny but very important and often what feel like not for many people, they obviously are not very, very lived, but for people in power, a lot of these conversations feel very abstract, the abstract issue of racism as opposed to the like lived visceral experience of racism. And so if you can take that abstract idea and put it into something that nearly all of us find very visceral, it really opens people's conversations up. And it was a really good kind of wheel greaser for that kind of work. And what I found really fascinating was when I said to people, what do you want to do next? I thought 100% of them would go something on sex education. And none of them said that. They all said like alcoholism, anti-racism. I think someone was talking about like homophobia. Like, so for the educators running it, they didn't take sex education as a sex education issue. They took it as a social justice issue, and they found it to be a really great stepping stone for whatever social justice issue they kind of next wanted to bring into the program. So that really surprised me, but it was a fantastic thing to find, because what came out was that because sex education is so incredibly human as a topic and has a degree of universality, is like a really, really dangerous word because everyone's experience is so incredibly individual. But because it has a degree of universality in its impact on us, you know, sort of mentally and emotionally, it kind of meant that it created a lot of inroads into saying, let's have a more emotional conversation as a social justice aim. And that, I think, was one of, you know, my favorite things I kind of didn't expect to find and did. So yeah, I would say like it's an important part of activism, in that activism can't exist without sex positivity. I don't think you can have sex negative good society. And then sex positivity can't exist without activism. You can't have a nice sex positive environment that doesn't acknowledge the problems of racism, that doesn't acknowledge the problems of ableism, etc. Like it needs to be, they need to work together, and they work together very, very well. I hope that kind of
Yeah, thank you so much. That was very insightful, very eye-opening. I really appreciate your words. Unfortunately, we are reaching the end of our time, but I'd like to thank you again for giving us the opportunity to speak to you about your research and about sex education. I also like to thank Femke for joining us as my co-host, and of course, thanking our listeners and our viewers for being interested in our talks. Thank you, everyone, and Femke, do you have anything else?
Thank you so much, Holly. It was really amazing and super interesting to listen to you. And I think you have made some amazing points that are, that probably you could talk so much more about it. But yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And again, like huge, congratulations on putting this program together. It sounds like it's really excellent. And I really hope that, I hope that, everyone is doing well and kind of taking some stuff from it. And if you guys have my contact details, so if anyone does want to have a chat ongoing, I feel like I'm very good at portraying myself as some great font of knowledge, but I can also connect you to people that know lots more than me. So if anyone wants to have a chat about anything, I'm very available, and I'm really grateful to be invited. It's been really fantastic to talk to you.
Nice. Great.
Okay, thank you everyone, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Yes. Bye.
Okay.
Stay tuned for next week, where we'll have the first Pink Talks Book Club edition with Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. Thank you for listening to Pink Talks. Before we go, show some love for our favorite podcast by leaving us a comment and subscribe to the channel. We are Young Educators, a non-profit organization working on human rights, gender equality, and active citizenship. And this podcast was created with the support of our team.
Leah Cheney,
Femke Becherer,
Ana Catarina Caldeira,
Laura Staffier,